Hi, humanity. I've watched, I don't know, a few minutes of this flashback, the story behind the white guy in the historic photo, um, the Olympic Games, a guy named Peter Norman. Um, I just found out that he had given them his gloves. Those were his gloves. He was wearing a pro human rights patch. This story is bringing me to tears. Look at this.
Different times for the 200 and five. Now, in Australia, there were consequences. 4 years later, at the 1972 Summer Olympics that took place in Munich, Germany, Norman wasn't part of the Australian sprinters team, despite having run qualifying times for the 200 meters 13 times and the 100 meters 5 times. So, just to be clear on that, he made it onto the team, fair and square, 13 different times for the 200 and 5 times for the 100. They said, yeah, that's true, but you stood with those black guys, so you're not allowed on the team.
Humanity, is it really, can we please start doing better? Because it's 2018 and I kind of don't see us doing any better. We need to do better. If there's anybody in your social sphere that you can influence, persuade, because really it's about not holding leaders accountable for their pathological behavior and not voting out pathological, psychopathic, predatory leaders. It's about compliance with toxic leadership. This is bringing me to tears. I'm having go on.
Films for Action continues. Back in the change-resisting, whitewashed Australia, he was treated like an outsider, his family outcasted, and work impossible to find. For a time, he worked as a gym teacher, continuing to struggle against inequalities as a trade unionist, and occasionally working in a butcher shop.
Got a silver medal. He qualified for the next Olympics for the 200, 13 times for the 100, 5 times, if I'm not remembering correctly. Struggling to even find work as a gym teacher.
John Carlos continued to say, if we were getting beat up, and they were, there was a lot of consequences for Carlos and Smith when they came back. They were thrown out of our Olympic committee and our teams. They were stripped of their medals. But Carlos says, if we were getting beat up, Peter was facing an entire country and suffering alone. Now, even as we celebrate Carlos and Smith here in this country, for example, San Jose University has a statue up of that moment. And let's take a look at that statue for a second. And this is not unusual. I don't mean to pick on them. But Norman's completely left out of the statue.
He's not even there. The thought came to my mind, if I'm ever so fortunate, because I have a daughter, and if I'm ever so fortunate to have a son, I kind of want to name my son either Peter or Norman. Got another friend, last name Norman. We'll see how that would go, but this is heart-wrenching.
He's not even there. Nobody ever talks about it, right? Well, turns out that Norman could have saved himself, and here's a further explanation of that. Remember, his life is ruined. They won't let him go back into the Olympics. They won't let him do anything related to the Olympics. Has to work in a butcher shop. There is one way out. For years, Norman had only one chance to save himself. He was invited to condemn his co-athletes, John Carlos and Tommy Smith's gesture, in exchange for a pardon from the system that ostracized him. A pardon that would have allowed him to find a stable job through the Australian Olympic Committee and be part of the organization of the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games. Norman never gave in and never condemned the choice of the two Americans.
For the 2000? Is it going to continue the ad? Okay. for the 2000 Olympic Games.
The Sydney Olympic Games. This gesture in exchange for a pardon from the system that ostracized.
He has to condemn them. How does that work? I condemn. Did he have like a condemn hammer? The hammer of condemnation. Like Thor.
A pardon that would have allowed him to find a stable job through the Australian Olympic Committee and be part of the organization.
He would have gotten a job to organize the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games. That's year 2000. It's only 2018. That's like, that's the 21st century. He never gave in and never condemned what choice that they wore.
For the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games, Norman never gave in and never condemned the choice of the two Americans. That's the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games. Even though he was one of their literally greatest athletes in Australian history.
Yeah, I just heard that race he ran the Australian record for the 200-meter sprint, if that's, I'm not a track and field guy, that stands to this day. Is
They did not let him march, let alone giving him a job. They didn't let him march in the 2000 Sydney Olympics under the banner of Australia. That was well after apartheid's gone. All that old system is beaten down. They're past it, but they still held a grudge. How dare you not denounce those two black guys?
Denounce?
In 2006, Norman died. Unfortunately, no better off financially in his life. And when he was being buried, his two old friends, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, went to his funeral and carried his casket. Finally, in the year 2012, the Australian Parliament passed a law saying apologies to Peter Norman for the wrong done by Australia in failing to send him to the 1972 Munich Olympics, despite repeatedly qualifying, and belatedly recognized the powerful role that Peter Norman played in furthering racial equality. Look, what everybody did there was brave, heroic. And we know about John Carlos and Tommy Smith, and they are rightfully celebrated now. But let's not forget Peter Norman, who was one of the quiet heroes. And that happens in all of these movements. They're the guys we celebrate and the guys we know for very, very, very good reasons. But they're the quiet heroes who sometimes suffer alone. And in some ways, just as heroic, at least, because they're not celebrated. He was never celebrated in his life, and he died being ostracized from his own country. And he took all that on for one simple reason, because he wanted to do the right thing. And when they asked him, hey, are you mad at Carlos and Smith for taking away your moment? You broke this record for your own country. You ran an amazing race, and all the news was about them. And he answered, I couldn't have been prouder to be part of that moment. Unfortunately, he took that to his grave. There are great heroes in the world, some we know about and some we don't. Thank you, Peter Norman.
For me, obviously with sort of my skin tone here and having grown up in Chicago and I've gone to a totally majority black high school. I see that white guy with the two black guys. It's sort of like, we had 3 white starters on my football team. So obviously I'm going to be like a white guy who kind of identifies with Peter Norman. And also it takes a lot of adjustment for me. I was going to say medically, but for me to even consider myself white, because that's not really a European concept. I was raised as a Latvian, as an exile Latvian in Chicago. But, my years where I was intensely athletic, I would be sort of a white guy among mostly black guys. So I, sort of see this, and I think there's something about sports and athletics and the character building involved that you really understand that it's not about race, and it's about racing, and it's about being your best self. I don't know if I can say anything worthwhile at this moment, but I didn't know that about the 72 Olympics. I didn't know that about the 2000 Olympics. And shame on you, Australia. Shame on you and your parliament. Shame on your politicians. Shame on your politics. Shame on you, really. Humanity can do better. It is up to our leadership to also show better. It's up to our population to be better and hold our leaders accountable.